The rain pounded against the weathered clinic windows, droplets racing down the glass like tears. Lightning occasionally illuminated the modest waiting room, where worn chairs and outdated medical posters told the story of a place time had forgotten. In a world obsessed with progress and prosperity, there are corners where dedication still outshines ambition, places where the quiet commitment of one can mean everything to many. Sometimes the universe has a peculiar way of acknowledging selfless acts, not with immediate rewards, but with unexpected encounters that arrive precisely when needed most. In Oak Ridge Valley, a forgotten town nestled between rolling hills and abandoned mining operations. This is how our story begins with Dr. Michael Carson, a rural physician whose medical brilliance was matched only by his growing disillusionment. At 53, with graying temples and hands that had delivered 3 generations of townsfolk, he was about to discover that sometimes miracles work in reverse. Sometimes those who heal others are themselves in desperate need of healing. The thunderclap that shook the clinic that rainy Tuesday morning would herald more than just another storm. Dr. Michael Carson, 53 years old, was a rural physician in a town most GPS systems couldn't locate. His white coat, once pristine, now bore the subtle signs of age and overuse. A frayed collar, a small coffee stain near the pocket, and a pen mark that had survived countless washes. His face, though lined with the inevitable markers of time, still carried the alert, compassionate gaze that had earned the town's unwavering trust. 25 years ago, Michael had been the rising star of Johns Hopkins Medical Center. With publications in prestigious journals and invitations to international conferences, his career trajectory pointed toward departmental leadership, research grants, and the comfortable life of an esteemed medical authority. His colleagues predicted he would revolutionize pediatric neurology with his innovative approaches to treating rare childhood disorders. Then came the accident. Driving home after a 36-hour shift, Michael had closed his eyes for what felt like a second. The resulting crash claimed no lives, but left a young girl permanently injured. Though legally cleared of wrongdoing, the guilt had consumed him. The hospital offered support, but Michael couldn't bear the fluorescent lights that now seemed to illuminate his failure. Without announcement, he packed his medical degree and stethoscope and disappeared from the medical elite. Now his day began at 5:30 a.m. in a clinic that doubled as his home. The waiting room furniture had been donated by a defunct dentist's office 2 towns over. The examination tables were refurbished with his own hands. Medical supplies arrived infrequently, ordered carefully from his dwindling savings. The town's collapsing mining economy meant that most of his patients couldn't pay with anything more than homemade bread, fresh eggs, or promises of future payment that both parties knew would never materialize. Last month, he'd performed an emergency appendectomy by flashlight during a power outage. The payment? A handcrafted birdhouse that now hung outside his kitchen window. His refrigerator contained 3 vials of expensive insulin he'd purchased using his own credit card for Mrs. Abernathy, whose insurance had denied her claim for the 5th time. His bookshelf held medical textbooks with highlighted passages and scribbled notes. His ongoing effort to keep pace with medical advancements despite limited internet access. Every night, Michael would sit at his desk, rubbing his aching back, and open a worn leather journal. Inside was a letter he'd never sent to the girl from the accident, attempting to explain an inexplicable failure. Next to it lay a photograph of his late wife, Sarah, who had followed him to this town only to succumb to cancer 3 years later. The rural setting that was his penance had also been her final view. "Just one more year," he whispered to her photo. "One more year and I'll have paid enough." But he'd been saying this for over 2 decades. Despite everything, Michael still performed small miracles. Last week, he'd fashioned a splint for Tommy Baker, using supplies from the hardware store. He'd recognized Mrs. Johnson's symptoms as a rare thyroid condition when the regional hospital had dismissed her complaints as anxiety. He'd delivered babies on kitchen tables and diagnosed illnesses with equipment 2 generations obsolete. When 9-year-old Lisa Martin caught pneumonia but couldn't afford antibiotics, Michael had driven 2 hours to a former colleague who slipped him samples without documentation. "You're wasting your talent here," the colleague had said. Michael had simply smiled and replied, "No, I'm using it exactly where it's needed." The rain continued to fall as Michael prepared the clinic for another day, unaware that this particular Tuesday would redefine everything he believed about redemption and second chances. It was on a stormy Tuesday morning that everything changed. The clinic waiting room was empty except for Miss Hazel, the elderly receptionist who volunteered 3 days a week in exchange for medication for her arthritis. The rain drummed a steady rhythm against the metal roof, creating a symphony of tinny echoes throughout the small building. Michael was inventorying supplies, counting gauze pads and reorganizing the cabinet where he kept donated medications, when the front door burst open. A woman stumbled in, drenched and disheveled, carrying a small bundle wrapped tightly in a blue blanket. Her eyes were wide with panic, mascara running down her cheeks, expensive clothes clinging to her slender frame. "Please," she gasped, water pooling at her feet on the linoleum floor. "My son. He won't speak, won't respond. Something's wrong." Michael immediately guided her to examination room 1, the only room where the ceiling didn't leak. The woman moved with an urgency that spoke of genuine fear, yet carried herself with a subtle poise that seemed at odds with their rural surroundings. Her accent wasn't local, her vowels too crisp, her consonants too defined for Oakridge. As she unwrapped the blanket, Michael saw a boy of about 7. The child's eyes were open but unfocused, his skin pale with a concerning bluish tint around his lips. Most striking was his absolute silence. No crying, no whimpering, just a vacant stare that stirred something in Michael's medical instincts. "How long has he been like this?" Michael asked, reaching for his stethoscope. "Since this morning," the woman replied, her voice breaking. "We were driving through a shortcut the GPS suggested, when he started feeling ill. Then the storm hit, our car hydroplaned off the road, and now he's not responding to me at all." Michael listened to the boy's heart, frowned, and checked his pupils. Something was familiar about the constellation of symptoms. He reached for the boy's wrist, counting silently, then examined a rash just barely visible beneath the collar of his pajamas. In that moment, 20 years of medical education crystallized into a moment of clarity. "It's Kawasaki disease," Michael said quietly. "Uncommon, but I've seen it before. We need to start treatment immediately." The woman's face contorted with confusion. "Kawasaki? But how, shouldn't we get to a hospital? There must be one in the next town." Michael shook his head, already moving to the storage cabinet where he kept his most precious medications. "There's no time. The nearest hospital is 40 minutes away, and they'll take another hour for diagnosis. The risk of cardiac complications increases every hour we wait." He hesitated, hand on the cabinet door. The treatment would deplete the IV immunoglobulin he'd been saving for emergencies, medication he'd paid for himself, worth more than he earned in 2 months. The boy's lips were getting bluer, his breathing more labored. Without another word, Michael unlocked the cabinet and retrieved the medication. As he prepared the IV, his hands moved with practiced precision despite the antiquated equipment. This was why he'd become a doctor, not for publications or accolades, but for moments when knowledge and action could stand between a child and disaster. "Will this help him?" the woman asked, clutching her son's limp hand. "It should," Michael replied, inserting the IV needle with gentle expertise. "He'll need monitoring and follow-up, but this should stop the progression." For 3 hours, Michael sat beside the boy, monitoring every change in his condition, adjusting the drip rate, checking vital signs. The woman watched in silent vigilance, occasionally wiping tears from her eyes. Outside, the storm gradually subsided, leaving only the rhythmic dripping from the clinic's leaking roof. Slowly, color returned to the boy's face. His eyes began to focus, and eventually he spoke his first word in hours. "Mom?" The relief that washed over the woman's face was a payment more valuable than any currency. She embraced her son, then looked up at Michael with eyes swimming in gratitude. "How can I ever repay you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael gave a tired smile, the kind that had become his signature, gentle, but tinged with resignation. Just seeing him better is enough. He wrote down instructions for follow-up care and warning signs to watch for. "Take him to your regular pediatrician when you get home." As the woman gathered her belongings, Michael noticed her studying the dilapidated clinic, the water stains on the ceiling, the mismatched furniture, the outdated equipment. Something in her gaze shifted, but he was too exhausted to decipher it. The woman and her son left as quietly as they had arrived, disappearing into the clearing day, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts and one less emergency treatment in his dwindling supplies. 3 weeks had passed since the rainy morning encounter. Michael continued his daily routine, setting broken bones, treating influenza, delivering prescriptions to elderly patients who couldn't drive to the clinic. The boy with Kawasaki disease had faded into the background of countless patients he'd treated over the years, though Michael occasionally wondered if the follow-up care had gone well. On a surprisingly sunny Thursday, Michael was in the back garden attempting to salvage his struggling tomato plants when he heard an unusual sound, a rhythmic thumping that grew louder by the second, accompanied by a mechanical whir that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. Stepping around the clinic, he shielded his eyes against the sun and stared in disbelief. A sleek black helicopter was descending onto the overgrown field beside his clinic, its rotors sending dust and debris swirling in all directions. The townspeople emerged from nearby buildings, equally stunned by the unprecedented arrival. "What in God's name?" Michael muttered, approaching cautiously as the engine powered down. When the door opened, the woman from the storm stepped out. Gone was the disheveled, panicked mother. In her place stood someone who exuded authority, tailored suit, immaculate hair, and the confident posture of someone accustomed to command. Following her was the boy, now vibrant and energetic, clutching a handmade card. "Dr. Carson," she called out, striding toward him with an extended hand. "I believe we have unfinished business." Michael shook her hand automatically, confusion evident on his face. "Your son looks well. That's all the business I need concluded." She smiled, a genuine expression that softened her professional demeanor. "Allow me to properly introduce myself. I'm Dr. Eleanor Winters, Chief of Pediatric Medicine at Northwell Health System." The name struck Michael like a physical blow. Northwell, one of the largest healthcare providers on the East Coast, renowned for innovation and excellence. He'd applied there once, decades ago, before his life had taken its detour. "And this," she continued, placing her hands on her son's shoulders, "is Jacob, who has something to say to you." The boy stepped forward, offering the handmade card. "Thank you for saving my life, Dr. Carson," he said clearly. "Mom says you're a hero." Michael accepted the card with unsteady hands. Inside was a child's drawing of a man in a white coat surrounded by stars. Eleanor Winters watched him carefully. "After we left, I had Jacob examined at our hospital. Your diagnosis was spot on. Your treatment protocol was flawless despite your limited resources. Then I became curious." She paused meaningfully. "Michael Carson from Johns Hopkins, author of 3 groundbreaking papers on pediatric neurological disorders, disappeared from the medical community 25 years ago." Michael stiffened. "That was another lifetime. I pulled your medical license records. You've maintained it all these years, continuing education credits and all, despite..." She gestured at the modest clinic behind them. "I never stopped being a doctor," Michael said quietly. "I just stopped being ambitious." Eleanor's expression softened. "After you saved Jacob, I made some inquiries in town. 25 years of service. Patients who can't pay. Procedures performed with equipment that belongs in a museum." She shook her head in wonder. "Do you know what we would call that at Northwell? We'd call it extraordinary." Michael stood silent, the weight of the past and the unexpected present colliding within him. "I didn't come just to thank you," Eleanor said, her voice taking on a new tone. "I came to offer you a chance to do more good than you ever thought possible." Eleanor elaborated on her proposition as they sat in Michael's cramped office, where medical journals from 5 years ago shared space with patient files handwritten on yellowing paper. "Northwell is establishing a rural medicine initiative," she explained. "We're creating mobile clinics, telehealth networks, and training programs specifically designed for underserved communities. We need someone to lead it, someone who understands both cutting-edge medicine and the realities of practicing in places the healthcare system has forgotten." Michael stared at the chipped mug in his hands. "You're offering me a job." "I'm offering you a department," Eleanor corrected. "Full funding, a team of dedicated professionals, and the resources to help communities like this one across the entire region." The proposition hung in the air between them, almost too monumental to comprehend. Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, possibility. Yet with it came the familiar weight of unworthiness. "I haven't practiced modern medicine in 25 years, he said finally. "The techniques, the technology, it's all changed." "But the fundamentals haven't," Eleanor countered. "You diagnosed a rare condition in my son using primarily observation and instinct. That can't be taught in medical school." Michael stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the town. "You don't understand. I came here as penance. That accident—" "I know about the accident," Eleanor interrupted gently. "I read the records. A tragedy, yes, but the investigation cleared you of negligence. The hospital's mandatory shift policies were deemed the primary factor. That doesn't change what happened to that girl." Michael's voice cracked slightly. Eleanor was silent for a moment before speaking softly. "Her name is Rebecca Stevens. She's 31 now, married with a daughter of her own. She's a physical therapist, inspired, she says, by the doctors who helped her recover." Michael turned, stunned. "You spoke to her?" "I did. She's never blamed you. She said she'd wondered what happened to the doctor, who cried at her bedside and promised to make it right somehow." The weight of 25 years seemed to press down on Michael's shoulders. Could redemption really be this simple? This unexpected? Just then, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see a crowd gathering, not around the helicopter, but around a pickup truck that had pulled up. Inside was 8-year-old Timmy Garner, clutching his arm at an unnatural angle after falling from a tree. His father, a coal miner laid off 3 years prior, looked desperate. "I need to handle this," Michael said automatically. Eleanor nodded. "I'll watch." For the next hour, Eleanor observed as Michael set the boy's broken arm with minimal pain medication, all he had in stock, fashioning a cast from supplies clearly rationed for emergencies. She watched as he declined payment from the father who had nothing to give, instead accepting a promise that Timmy would return for a checkup in 2 weeks. She noted how he spoke directly to the frightened child, explaining each step with compassion that transcended the clinic's limitations. When they were again alone, Eleanor spoke with newfound determination. "This is exactly why you need to accept my offer. Not just for yourself, but for every Timmy in every forgotten town who deserves better than a choice between substandard care or no care at all." For the first time in 25 years, Michael allowed himself to envision a different future, one where his self-imposed exile might transform into purpose. The girl from the accident was living her life. Perhaps it was time he truly lived his. "There's one condition," Michael said finally. "This clinic stays open. Whatever happens, Oak Ridge doesn't lose its doctor." Eleanor smiled, extending her hand. "I think we can arrange that. Welcome to Northwell, Dr. Carson." Tentatively, like a man stepping onto ice unsure of its thickness, Michael reached out and shook her hand. 1 year later, the transformation was evident in both the man and his surroundings. The Oak Ridge Clinic now stood renovated, but deliberately maintained its humble character. Modernized examination rooms coexisting with the original wooden reception desk where Miss Hazel still greeted patients. State-of-the-art equipment hummed quietly in rooms where leaks had once required strategic placement of buckets during rainstorms. Michael, now dressed in a new white coat bearing both the Northwell logo and a custom Oak Ridge Clinic embroidery, moved with renewed energy. The past year had been a whirlwind of change, 3 months of intensive refresher training, the establishment of 6 similar clinics in surrounding communities, and the implementation of a telehealth system that connected rural patients with specialists hours away. Today was special, the small parking lot filled with cars bearing license plates from across the state. Inside, nervous excitement buzzed among the gathering crowd. Former patients, local residents, and medical professionals who had traveled to witness the official inauguration of the Rural Medicine Initiative's flagship clinic. Among the visitors was a woman in her early 30s, moving confidently despite the slight limp in her gait. Beside her stood a young girl of about 8, and a man who kept his hand supportively at the small of her back. When Michael emerged from his office and saw her, time seemed to stop. He would have recognized her anywhere. Her eyes were exactly as he remembered from that night 26 years ago, when they had fixed on him from a hospital bed with confusion and pain. "Rebecca," he whispered, his voice nearly failing him. She approached with a gentle smile. "Dr. Carson, Eleanor told me I might find you here." Michael struggled for words, decades of rehearsed apologies suddenly inadequate. "I've wanted to tell you," Rebecca shook her head, stopping him. "You already did that night in the hospital, and every day since, from what I hear, through every child you've treated." She gestured to her daughter. "This is Emma. She wants to be a doctor someday." The little girl looked up at Michael with unbridled curiosity. "Mum says you fix people in places where nobody else will go. Is that true?" Something broke open inside Michael, Not painfully, but like a dam giving way to clear, cleansing water. "I try," he managed to say. From the doorway, Eleanor watched the interaction with Jacob at her side. The boy who had once been silent and blue-lipped now chatted animatedly with local children, proudly showing them his clinic. Later, as Michael cut the ribbon officially opening the new facility, he glanced across the crowd, at Rebecca, who had found her own path to healing, at Eleanor and Jacob, whose unexpected appearance had catalyzed his second chance, at the townspeople who had accepted him when he couldn't accept himself, and at the young doctors who would train here, learning that medicine was as much about presence as procedures. "Sometimes," he said into the microphone, voice steady with newfound purpose, "healing works in both directions. Sometimes the paths we choose in our darkest moments lead us precisely where we need to be, not for the reasons we expected, but for purposes beyond our imagination. In the quietest corners of our lives, in the places we go to hide from the world, we may unknowingly be preparing for our greatest contributions." For Dr. Michael Carson and Dr. Eleanor Winters, a chance encounter during a storm created ripples that would transform not just two lives, but entire communities forgotten by progress. A single act of selfless care, a rural doctor treating a silent child for free, became the cornerstone of a movement that would bring medicine back to places where hope had been the only prescription available. Perhaps that's the beautiful paradox of redemption, that our deepest wounds, when finally exposed to light, can become the very map leading others out of similar darkness. And you, watching this story unfold, when was the last time you witnessed a small act of kindness that changed everything? Perhaps today, somewhere, someone is performing such an act without realizing its power to heal not just others, but themselves.